So, Dark Eyes, we got here finally. The epic saga of sci-fi madness and lunacy was a long and ambitious one, and while really technobabble heavy, fun game. Start a tally for the amount of times that you hear the words retrogenitor particles throughout the duration. I seriously applaud the cast for managing to say it so many fucking times. I thought Dark Eyes was a fun ride while it lasted, and for the most part, underlining for the most part 80 billion fucking times, I think it works. Although it does have its screamingly obvious pitfalls and is a touch fanficky in places and ends up sounding a bit more like... And then the Master and the Daleks and the Doctor and Centaurans were all fighting each other and they all go blam 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 shooty explodey blam. The Dark Eyes saga does wear its behind-the-scenes issues on its sleeve, and I think I respect it more than I am actually enthusiastic about it, like lots of people are. I feel it suffers a bit from essentially being started as an experiment that was recontextualised after finally deciding what they wanted to do with it. Part 1 was clearly written without much of an idea about where the series would go, 2 is trying to find out where it's going, and it finally decides what it's going for in Part 3, by which point they were having serious scheduling issues. Not really having a clear defined goal from the outset was definitely the big problem of the series, but I listened back to the whole thing in preparation for talking about it, and while I will, as ever, sling shit at it where I feel it necessary, it was an enjoyable experience. Though if you're going to check it out, if I were you, I would definitely wait until they have one of their weekend offers on it, cause 40 quid a box set is pretty fucking steep. It's quite unlike the previous two eras of the 8th Doctor, Era 1 being a bit bloated and pretentious, but ultimately a lovable scamp that you just wanted to go, "Oh, you got a bit in over your head there, didn't you?" whenever it fucked up, cause when it hit so incredibly hard that you couldn't really begrudge it of much in the end because of that. Era 2 being the popular one, taking bits of Era 1, retooling itself for a wider audience, and while really good, astonishingly so in many cases, particularly its first and final seasons, which represent some of Bigfinish's finest works, it did have its instances of leaving me a bit put out by its populist approach. Yes, I'm a pretentious hipster, you should know this by now. While Era 3 is a bit of a different beast, it's a space opera of a universe-shaking apocalyptic war across time and space between the Daleks, the Time Lords, and manifestations of a universal consciousness. While overall box sets themselves flow a bit disjointedly into one another, it's sort of meant to be one 16-hour-long story, and if you're new to this, I bet you can all guess what the pitch is before I even have to fucking say it. The Daleks and the Time Lords have got to have a war at some point while the 8th Doctor's around, and we need some higher stakes and tensions evident for the continuity to make sense. Which I guess is kinda the reason why I'm not as enthusiastic about this direction that we've been going in, and with the emergence of the War Doctor. To me, it's kinda like the Star Wars prequel problem. Well, one of many, and no, it's nowhere near that. When you're writing a lead up to events that we already know are going to happen, it's very easy to become a bit too bogged down in trying to make sure that everything fits into place, and creativity and innovation can kinda get a bit lost along the way. Dark Eyes 1 is entirely penned by Nick Briggs, and while it's a tad meandering, it's got a great premise that you can easily sum up in a sentence. The Daleks hatch a plan to erase the Time Lords from existence, and the series spirals into the consequences of said plan, involving altering the timelines and creation of newer, deadlier threats as the consequences. The Great War opens the first box set and is the ideal conceit to kickstart the story. The newly companionless depressed Doctor is handed a mysterious assignment by a Time Lord from his school days called Straxus, and the Doctor finds a DNA trace that he's looking for resides in the trenches of World War I, where the Daleks are conducting dangerous experiments integral to their gambit. The Doctor runs into Molly O'Sullivan, who's an Irish trench fad with the eponymous dark eyes, and while Ruth Bradley has a tendency to overplay her at times, and some people kind of find her idiosyncrasies annoying, for example she calls the TARDIS his tardy box, but Molly does feel like a real vad from the trenches of World War I. What I really like is that the narrative doesn't lick her shoes like with lots of the new Who companions. She does and says lots of horrible things that may put people off her, but the story itself does try and understand why. I've noticed it's becoming a running theme in Bigfinish of late of them playing about with an element commonly seen in New Who, but adding their own spin on it. In this case, the "oh my god, this random person is the most important person in the history of existence." The Great War's greatest triumph, though, is introducing a character, and it makes her in a very subtle way... subtle. You get it, New Who? Subtle. In a very subtle way key to the overarching sci-fi plot, it puts a lot more effort into making her feel like a real person rather than focusing on the fact that she's an element in the series' plot. So yeah, Great War is a really fun opening statement for the Dark Eyes series. It does a really good job with Molly, it's very atmospheric, the soundscape's really something, and I felt having the Daleks absent for most of the story was the right idea. A lot of people have the rather relevant complaint that they've become less scary now that we're more familiar with them, but they are more intimidating in this instance when they're hidden behind the veil of the scenario that we're in. Next up we got Fugitives. Following the Doctor saving Molly from the trenches, it sees them chased from location to location by the Daleks, a la the classic Who serial The Chase, as a means of easing Molly into the role of companion by offering smaller glimpses of larger stories. While I do see the purpose of putting something like this here, Fugitives is probably the weakest of this box set as it pretty much only exists to bridge the gap between the Great War and the next one, Tangled Web, where the plot kicks in again. A lot of the runtime of this one feels more like scenes we have to have at some point, so let's just have them now, rather than its own instalment. It's made up of 3 fragments. The Doctor accidentally takes Molly to the Second World War, then they're chased through London in the 1970s, and then they go and do some shit in space. Which is done to make you feel the pace, but personally, at around the middle where the Doctor and Molly show up at the Ides Institute, which is a secret organisation kinda similar to Torchwood, who turn out to be sort of important later on, where we introduce Dr. Sally Armstrong, and the Daleks show up to wreck shit up and chase them through London. It's an awesome little sequence, it's a really fun piece of this story, but I just didn't think we spent nearly long enough on it. Just as soon as I was getting into it, suddenly it was over and then we move into an offbeat, light-hearted, fluffy sequence where the Doctor and Molly do some bonding over gravity swimming with flying dolphins. Ah! Fuck. Tonal whiplash! Tonal whiplash! 2 good ideas, yes, and you needed both of them to happen at some point, but it's just a bit jolty in the way it goes from one to the other in the same story. Particularly given just how much I was enjoying the Ides Institute bit. Fugitives feels kinda scattered, but as said, I do see why they do it, as if they'd gone straight into more of the Dark Eyes overall plot, it wouldn't really have given Molly and the Doctor's relationship much of a chance, and it being more light-hearted than the Great War, some are off-put by that, but I kinda think that while not the best and it has its problems, this one was a necessary step. Next up we got Tangled Web, and it's similarly structured to Fugitives, but it's a bit more plot heavy and is kind of weird and a little bit twisted. It was at this point that I started thinking that Dark Eyes probably started life as a full 5th series of the 8th Doctor adventures before the box set idea came about and it was cut down and condensed. And in the cases of Tangled Web and Fugitives, they appear to have started life as 3 separate stories woven into one. Tangled Web's a really fun comic booky little yarn though, and it has a bit more purpose about it than Fugitives does. There's the establishing Molly being given her dark eyes upon being kidnapped as a child and taken into a mysterious stranger's TARDIS, which is kind of fucking creepy when you say it out loud. And then there's... Okay, I said to myself that I was going to try and avoid spoiling this, but it's possibly the fucking coolest thing ever, and I can't help myself. The Doctor and Molly wind up in an alternate universe where the Dalek city on Skaro is adorned with flowers, and children are playing with the Daleks, who are evolving into docile creatures that use their old casings to have daytime naps in. Honestly, I think this sequence makes the entire thing worth it. Hell, I wanted this bit to be the whole thing, I really enjoyed it. That's the problem that some people such as myself have with Dark Eyes 1. There are a lot of great ideas strewn about the place that are just really compacted. While Tangled Web is really fun, I just would have liked to have explored some of the weird alternate realities that were presented within it a bit more. Next up we got X and the Daleks, and yes, the stupid names do become a trend. Basically, there's been a Time Lord working with the Dalek time controller, and the Doctor and Straxus show up to stop him. Yeah, it's a lot simpler than most of what Bigfinish do. X and the Daleks is kind of indicative of why some people find Dark Eyes a bit frustrating, as it's the most technobabble heavy edition yet, which would become a running trend. That X and the Daleks has the unfortunate task of weaving all of the threads that we'd had introduced so far into one big ball, and while it's noticeably less impressive than most of what we'd had so far, it was a satisfying enough conclusion to the events of this box set, as the Dalek time controller's plans are foiled in a really clever way, only to inadvertently set the stage for the follow-up. It's a little bit convoluted, yes, but it's clear that Dark Eyes 1 was written at a point where they were unsure whereabouts they were going, so I do understand why it ended like this. And I did still enjoy it. The ending of this one kind of set me in mind of one of Futurama's "we're not sure if we're going to end up making more of this" cliffhangers, when the future of the series was uncertain, and the characters make self-aware allusions to that. Dark Eyes 2 is my favourite box set of the series, as it's got some great concepts to work with, and they all feel like they have room to breathe. There's no fragmented stories here, each one is its own separate plot that works on its own, and while each story is blatantly part of the bigger picture, they all have a tighter focus on the story at hand. Kinda like in the way that the Dalek serials from 80s Who have long-running elements, but do work well in their own right. We start off with the Traitor, and it's a self-contained traditional tale of the Doctor helps the rebels on a planet somewhere controlled by the Daleks, where it turns out that the Doctor has to choose which threat is bigger, the Daleks or another enemy that he's already met by this point that we haven't, that will benefit from the outcome of the Doctor trying to defeat the Daleks, so he's forced into the situation of having to try and help them. Some have complained that the Traitor kind of feels a bit pointless and more a prologue for Dark Eyes 2, as it's only really necessary to the whole thing in a conciliatory manner, and it only really starts to mean something once we've met the other important enemy of the Dark Eyes box sets, who show up later. But while it is mostly there for foreshadowing's sake, it gets the very simple job of telling a humans on a planet occupied by Daleks story done fairly well. Many people accuse this one of being a bit too traditional. Pretty much everything in it has been done before, and by Nick Briggs specifically. And yes, I do agree. I did notice the heavy recycling from his Dalek Empire series too. Although while very unoriginal, I found the Traitor an engaging enough listen. It's nothing special, yes, but it does improve upon re-listens with the context of later stories. Next up we got The White Room, and it's the only instalment by Bigfinish mainstay Alan Barnes. The Doctor winds up in London during one of the World Wars, because when isn't it, where he finds Molly, who's left him by this point, who's working at a hospital where he finds deserters from the war are disappearing in the night under mysterious circumstances. The cause of which is another set of aliens in one of Bigfinish's massive plots that stretches out across multiple ranges, who are kinda less important in this one, the Virons. It's not totally necessary to be aware of the whole story arc regarding the Virons, as I wasn't when I first heard this one, and it gets very complicated, but in short, the Virons created a vast array of deadly diseases and biological weapons for a war that they were waging galaxies away, of which peace was eventually reached, and the viruses were gathered together in the Amethyst Containment Station, because some idiot decided that gathering together all of the most dangerous things in existence into one place was a fucking genius move. But after an inevitable incident with the Sixth Doctor and the Daleks, the viruses were leaked out across the galaxy, so now the Virons are spending centuries travelling across time and space neutralising the viruses at all costs. Barnes is a seasoned Bigfinish veteran, and I enjoy his writing style, but this one's kind of middle ground. It has some decent ideas about it, and some really fucking strange ones that sound kind of weird when you say them out loud. There's this one weird sequence where the Doctor is literally thrown down a well. While the White Room's kind of baffling in parts, and the Virons don't really have that much to do with the Dark Eyes saga in the end, it's pretty much just there to reintroduce Molly and set up the finale of this box set, but it was a fairly decent hour all told. The third of this box set, Time's Horizon, is probably my favourite Dark Eyes story, and it's penned by a fairly newer name on Bigfinish, Matt Fitton, who's been a great find, and I really like that they've kept him around and spread his writing talent across many Bigfinish ranges, and he showcased a great ability to mould himself to the stylistic choices of each range. He's not always on ball, of course, but we all have our off days, and I do really appreciate how adaptable he is. Time's Horizon sees the Doctor and Molly on board a ship journeying to the edge of the universe on a mission of discovery, and at the edge of the universe they stumble across a hole in space or something. I don't know, insert technobabble word here. Out of which comes a thing that I have to spoil because it becomes very important to the Dark Eyes plot, the Eminence, which is a gaseous entity of a soul consciousness that reproduce by taking over people's bodies and physically transforming them into what they call the Infinite Warriors. Which, yes, I know it's a dorky name, shut up. There are a few parallels I could draw with Time's Horizon and Sword of Orion from ages ago, which I found lacking upon a revisitation, although while a lot of Time's Horizon's story beats and its atmosphere and vibe are very similar, what I loved about Time's Horizon is just its grand cosmic scope. I love sci-fi that's all about exploring space. It just taps into that childlike wonder that lots of us nerds had when we were kids learning about space for the first time. And while Time's Horizon goes a bit downhill in its second half, that first half is some of the best storytelling I've heard from Bigfinish in recent times. While it would have been nice for me to have actually had the context of the Eminence from their first appearance in Bigfinish, which I have got now, there's just something about Time's Horizon that just gets under your skin, and David Sibley does some amazing voiceover work for the Eminence. I really enjoyed this one. Eyes of the Master finishes up this box set, bringing our next big figure in the war between the Eminence, Daleks and the Time Lords into play, the Movellans. Oh, sorry, the Master. It is primarily one big setup for the final two box sets, but it essentially gets away with being a setup by also acting as a really nasty little horror story about the Master hiding in human society under the guise of an evil optician giving blind patients dodgy eye transplants instrumental to his purposes. See, this is what makes me really like Matt Fitton. He's a traditionalist when it comes to sci-fi and horror, but with his own unique demented ideas that don't feel like backpedaling or relying too much on pulp sci-fi reference points. And the idea in this one's fucking gold. Although what makes this one such a standout moment in the Dark Eye series is mostly down to one incredible bit of casting. If anyone had seen Alex McQueen in pretty much anything else prior to this, you probably would have agreed upon him being suggested as the new Bigfinish Master that is the fucking best idea ever. His voice is so charming and friendly, very posh, he enunciates every word with the utmost dignity, and he can pull off being a psychotic lunatic without having to be in your face about it, which is what makes his Master such a genuinely intimidating character. Yet while I do think that Michelle Gomez was a good choice for the Master, she was never going to compare. And I highly recommend that when Michelle Gomez leaves, they bring in Alex McQueen, because his Master needs a TV story. He makes cackling evil geniuses fun again, he's mature and sophisticated, but in a ruthless bastard kind of way. And he's just a shit ton of fun to listen to. Anyway, so, while I'm kind of patchy on Dark Eyes as a whole, Eyes of the Master and Time's Horizon were a terrific couple of entries that set up the war between the Eminence and pretty much the rest of the universe going on in box set 3, and they both sealed Fitton's status as one of Bigfinish's more popular regulars in recent times. Although I personally kinda think that the massive success of these first two box sets was a bit of a double-edged sword for Bigfinish, cause for the Doctor they took to lots of strange places and did lots of weird, out there and experimental things with, I kinda feel they've got a bit stuck on one setting with him from here on out. Anyway, join me next time for some slightly more muddled thoughts on Dark Eyes 3 and 4.